Can scholarships make up for having giant power poles in your backyard? And a fight over money. How a few extra dollars here can mean more police officers on the street. Plus, the last decade of fighting over school funding could be over. It's in the Kansas Supreme Court's room now. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. Thursday, a month late, Kansas lawmakers finally agreed on a school funding plan to meet the state Supreme Court's demands, but not without those who said this plan isn't good enough. As I explained in this report I filed with Cake News.
I've always believed that teachers are underpaid.
They need some laptops, there's desks with writing on them, sometimes there's books that are torn out. I think there's definitely an area of mismanagement in there somewhere.
Many Kansans agree the public education system needs fixing, though they don't agree on why or how. Much like the representatives in Topeka. Kansans were watching Thursday as those representatives debated a compromise plan to put more money into your child's education.
No one questions. We must track every penny.
I cannot support this plan because I know we can do better by our kids. Doing nothing was unacceptable.
The compromise deal adds $90 million a year for the next 4 years to public school funding.
I wouldn't have any problem with $90 million. I think that'd be a pretty good sum.
It also includes several measures designed to make schools more accountable to the state and taxpayers for how they spend that money. For example, it would require a one-page yearly performance report from each school district and individual building. Then the schools would have to post those reports online.
I think especially anytime there's money involved, accountability definitely needs to be taken to heart.
Some lawmakers, though, fear this deal won't be enough.
Plaintiffs have already said that this is not enough money. This bill solves nothing.
And joining me on the desk today, we have Rodney Wren, political analyst, former speechwriter for then Congressman Pompeo, and Travis Mounts, editor of the Times-Sentinel papers. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Now, one thing I noticed as I was working on that story is I talked to Wichtons who are not nearly as steeped in following this story as I have been, is that they want more money for the schools, but a lot of them think that there is some sort of mishandling of the money going on, and they want more accountability. At the same time, they just seem to want all of this over with. And that was really kind of the feeling that I got from some lawmakers this week up in Topeka, too. It's been kind of an exhausting decade.
I think there's a lot of fatigue tied into this for people in the legislature and for the taxpayers in the communities. In terms of whether you feel like districts are spending money well or not, I think a lot of people will feel like other districts aren't being as responsible as what their own is. With the size of districts that we cover, we've got 6A schools down to 1A, but in all the communities that we cover, the people on the school boards are your neighbors. There's direct relationships outside of the board meetings. And in most of those cases, I think they feel like their schools are doing well. Now, the people in these suburban towns and these rural towns may look at Kansas City districts, at the Wichita School District a little bit differently. But there's such different economies of scale there as well that it's kind of hard to compare apples and oranges.
But it doesn't sound like it's going to be over as well. I think it was this morning I heard on the radio that one of the attorneys for the plaintiffs said that this was not far enough and they didn't think the Supreme Court would accept it, and so there's going to have to be more done. So whether or not you're fatigued by this, I don't know if this is over or not.
Yeah, and the question that has come up this session and came up again this week as those concerns were raised is it time for a change to the state constitution to stop these lawsuits? I mean, we've been fighting in Kansas over how to fund our schools since the 1800s.
Right. I think you could look at this at a number of ways, and I'll just give you an example from my alma mater. Which the name's not important, but they tried on 3 separate occasions, and finally on the 3rd bond issue, it passed. But what citizens of my hometown were complaining about in the first 2 was that there was too much going to sports facilities and not enough going to the classroom. And so I think what a lot of people are concerned about is they want to look at how many administrators do these buildings have? What kind of pay are these administrators getting? What kind of support staff are there at the buildings? I think it's laughable for anybody to say any teacher is overpaid. And I'm a teacher, but that's neither here nor there. I teach at a private school, so I think people just want to make sure that the money is going to where it needs to be, and that's in the classroom. It's not in an aquatic center. It's not in new basketball courts. It may be in some new technology, but there's plenty of schools that are doing great things without one-to-one laptops. So I think there's going to be more fatigue on this, unfortunately, especially if the plaintiffs get their way.
I find it interesting you bring up the sports spending being a detriment, because back in the 90s, my school in Michigan, in order to get bonds passed, had to add sports items to it. And also the district that I worked in the most had to add sports items and auditoriums and that sort of stuff in order to get bonds passed.
Well, in several of our districts over the last handful of years, and including Renwick just earlier this week, have passed bond issues that were a mix of safety items, from storm shelters down to new locks and better windows at a couple of buildings, but then had music and sports facilities tied into them as well. And so that seems to have been the trend, at least in our area, of mixing those two things together. I think the overall complexity of funding of schools can be difficult for people to understand as well, since so much of your classroom funding is coming through the state, whereas so many of your capital things, the things that you see as shiny sports objects or whatever, are the ones that come up to votes locally.
Yeah. Well, while the whole school funding issue may or may not be settled at this point, the question of Medicaid expansion is far from it, with Kansas Governor Laura Kelly facing down against Senate President Susan Wagle on the topic, as KSN News' Craig Andrus shows us.
A few members of Senate leadership should not be allowed to block an initiative that will save lives.
The governor Tuesday said get Medicaid out of committee and get it onto the Senate floor for a vote. Senate President Susan Wagle still says that's a no-go.
Governor Kelly would like us to surrender to Obamacare, a broken and bloated system.
Wagle's claim is the Affordable Care Act does not work to provide good coverage, and said Medicaid still needs more study. Some Kansans say they want lawmakers to give it a vote this year and see what happens.
I've talked with so many people that they're not getting the care that they need.
Kevin didn't want to be identified, but he would apply for Medicaid again, he says, if lawmakers expand it. Those who administer health care to low-income Kansans say they're closely watching this fight in Topeka.
We believe in expanding Medicaid. It's something that we have advocated for the last 4 to 5 years.
GraceMed officials say there are many thousands just like Kevin in Wichita alone who could benefit from Medicaid. Some like Kevin have a message for lawmakers considering it.
Trying to get the help that we need and what we need and everything, I mean, is unreal.
And I know as I've covered this fight over Medicaid, I've only seen one current, meaning within the last 5 years, that I've found poll that showed Kansans not by a majority wanting Medicaid expansion. Lawmakers have passed it before. It was vetoed. They couldn't override the veto. It comes down to everyone I talk to says there are the votes in the Senate to do it. What is the benefit to some lawmakers in saying, you know what, now's not the time?
Well, if Susan is going to run for the Senate, and she's trying to build her conservative chops for that primary fight, then that could be one reason why she's sticking to her guns on this. Especially if the whip count, I tried to ask some questions why Ron Rickman even let it come to a vote in the House if they knew it was going to pass the House, and I couldn't get a straight answer on that from the people I tried talking to.
It was a sneak move on the part of Medicaid expansion supporters.
So if Wagle knows the whip count in the Senate and the Senate will pass it, I don't see Susan Wagle letting this come to the floor. And I'm not saying it's just for political purposes, because we don't know if she hasn't said that she's going to run for Roberts' U.S. Senate seat. But but my guess is that's probably a part of it. And if she just firmly believes it's problematic, then she's going to stick to her guns.
Well, I know certainly every time I've talked to her over this last several years, she's thought that there were problems with Medicaid expansion, but at the same time, a couple of years ago, when I was speaking with her, she was like, it's time to have the debate.
Sure.
And did bring it to the Senate floor, and it passed.
Right.
Well, and the political nature of things drives so many decisions. It's that's just such an underlying factor in today's politics. I know one of our state senators voted for expansion 2 years ago, and from everything that I've read up to this point, I don't think he would vote for it this time around. And I don't know what the motivations were 2 years ago and what has changed, or if 2 years ago it just felt like a safe vote because of the assumption of a brown bag veto and an inability to override it. And so, that vote and a different vote this time might both be trying to balance, various political pressures.
And there's some things happening at the federal level too, with President Trump saying that he wants an overhaul of the Affordable Care Act. You've got some Republicans in Kansas wanting work requirements tied to it, but you had the judge in Kentucky say that was unconstitutional. You've got another court case challenging the constitutionality of the entire Affordable Care Act in and of itself. So Susan Magel may want the debate, and I think she was on record as saying, let's push it off until next year. I think that is political cover, but nonetheless, that gives them time to debate it and probably to make some political decisions so that they can then perhaps come back in 2020 and say, we'll actually vote on it.
And there definitely was some concern about the potential changes at the federal level, right. And they actually changed wording in the Medicaid expansion bill to basically allow the state to pull back from expansion if the federal government pulled back from payments.
Right.
So, well, we'll have to wait and see. Like as with so much with the state government, got to wait until they decide they're actually going to talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the fight over Medicaid sparked an unusual protest at the State House and now a lawsuit from the ACLU. At the end of March, 3 Kansas State students took their concerns over Medicaid expansion to the State House, unfurling these giant banners from the 5th floor in the rotunda. Each banner calling out a House or Senate leader for what the students deemed to be a lack of action on Medicaid expansion. The banners stayed up for about 4 to 5 minutes before State House staff removed them. Now, the ACLU is suing Kansas Secretary of Administration Dwayne Goosen, State House Director of Administrative Services Tom Day, and the Superintendent of Kansas Highway Patrol, saying regulations requiring permits for assemblies or political demonstrations inside the State House or on State House grounds are a violation of constitutionally protected First Amendment rights. Currently, to hold a demonstration at the State House, Kansans are required to apply for a permit at least 10 days ahead of time, pay a $20 application fee, have a legislative sponsor, and be related to a governmental purpose. The Secretary of Administration has final approval. If given the permit, regulations say no banners, signs, exhibits, or any other materials will be taped, tacked, nailed, hung, or otherwise placed in any manner within the Capitol complex. House Majority Leader Dan Hawkins, one of those called out on the banners, says the regulations are there to prevent physical damage to the State House facilities. So, once again, we're balancing those things against protecting the State House and protecting First Amendment rights. From having read the filings, there sounds to me like there's a little bit of logic there that folks are not being allowed to have their say at the State House. Is that unusual?
I don't know if it's unusual, but even if the State House rules were so arcane as to not let them hang banners, I say who cares? Go for it. Practice some civil disobedience. I don't think hanging banners or having signs in the State House is hurting anyone except the people that got called out and it hurt their feelings. That's just my personal opinion. I understand the rule and not wanting to damage anything, but I would argue that the framers and the intent of the First Amendment and the spirit of the First Amendment certainly would trump any in any language to try to prevent damage to the State House. Obviously, unless somebody's coming with a bulldozer to try to knock down the State House. But hanging a banner from the State House, I mean, this is silly. Those kids should have been able to hang their banners.
Yeah. Well, and one of the interesting things was, in addition to the 3 kids, there was I believe, an instructor and a Topeka pastor who were there, and neither of the adults received the 1-year ban from the State House. And so it seemed like the punishment was not meted out evenly there. And of course, the 1-year ban was within days overturned. So, right. But yeah, unless you damage something, I'm kind of with you. No harm, no foul.
Right.
So this may be a case, perhaps. I mean, obviously we're playing judge at this point. That maybe we see a change in State House regulations.
And it probably should. I mean, and hopefully the ACLU. Again, personal opinion here. That's why you bring me here. Hopefully the ACLU wins out on this, and they're forced to change some of their language. I just think this is silly. Political protest is the highest form of patriotism, according to Thomas Jefferson. So I just think that it's nonsense to try to make some arcane rule prevent kids or adults from hanging a banner that can be taken down within seconds to see if anything's damaged.
Yeah. Well, and they made use of social media. I know they were live streaming the entire thing. They knew it wasn't going to last long.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of the purpose a lot of times.
Yeah. Is to make a splash, to get the attention, and well, they got their attention.
They did. Yeah, folks at the State House played right into it.
Yeah.
Gave them exactly what they were after.
Perhaps more than they were expecting. Yeah. Well, maybe be in court when all that comes down and let you guys know what happens when that goes around. Meanwhile, months after installing giant power poles throughout a northeast neighborhood here in Wichita, Westar is now offering to pay scholarships and give grants to local nonprofits trying to help folks in the area, perhaps to make up for the giant power poles. KSN's John Acebus shows us some folks in the area think it's too little, too late.
Is it enough and is it fair? Mixed emotions on all of that.
So I don't think it's enough.
The poles tower over Brandon Johnson's District 1.
I think those who hear about this will say, man, that's great, but I've still got this pole to look at.
He says he was on an advisory board that met with Westar to come up with a way to benefit the community where the poles are. His goal, much higher than what he says Westar announced.
And so I think, again, the reaction from folks as they begin to hear about this today is going to be, so what else do we get?
This donation today is to help benefit the community as a whole and to acknowledge that we want to invest in the community and that with this project we could have and should have done better.
$1 million of that $1.25 million that Westar is giving will benefit nonprofits in these 3 zip codes: 67208, 67214, and 67219.
On my ground.
Technically, from where he's standing, everything from the left of the red flag Westar has the rights to, and Pastor William Vann was compensated for it with money and land across the street at a good price. But still, even with that and the $1 million up for grabs for nonprofits, he has concern about how that money is going to be used.
The challenge becomes who benefits from the money. If somebody benefits from it who is not directly affected by it, then to me that's a lose.
And I know that Representative Gail Finney has really been pushing legislation to prevent something like this. She says that many folks who took the money didn't even know what they were signing off on. They expected that they were going to replace, Westar was going to replace wooden power poles with wooden power poles. And then suddenly these are big giant ones. She calls it bait and switch. She says that folks in her neighborhood, she lives in 67214, are losing value in their homes. Her own personal property, she says, has gone down $5,000. This is a big issue. And it really, if you look historically, it seems like Westar kind of picked on a neighborhood they could get away with it.
I can't speak to that. Perhaps Gail Finney and Brandon Johnson can. Westar is tasked with providing, is the lone provider of providing electricity in Kansas. And so as a free marketer, I see problems with that. But, they have a responsibility to do the best they can to provide electricity to their customers, which is everybody. Yeah. And they have to look out for some things. I think it's called, I can't remember the name of it, when they go and they cut down your trees. Mm-hmm. You know what? that's a bummer, and it can make your trees look awful, but they're trying to avoid lines coming down during storms. So I feel bad for anybody whose property value has gone down because these giant things went into place. If there was a bait and switch, I think that's problematic, but ultimately Westar is just trying to provide the best product, I think, in the best way they can, because this is Kansas. We get a lot of storms. We're trying to provide, I think they're just trying to provide as sturdy of an infrastructure as possible for those electrical lines.
Yeah, I wouldn't want one of those in my front yard. Nobody does, and if I had one of those sitting in my front yard, and a kid living 8 blocks away was getting a scholarship, I'm not sure that makes me feel better about the situation. I think Westar has essentially admitted that they could have handled this project better from the start, and that this is an effort to try to make up for that. Again, some folks are probably going to be very happy if they're the ones that benefit. If you don't really see anything, you got a giant pole in your yard, your property value goes down, you're not going to be pleased at all. And again, these things do have to go somewhere. But at the same time, you look across our country, the really nice neighborhoods probably don't deal with these issues as much as some other neighborhoods. Yeah. So, there is historically a pattern there, and it's not just Wichita, not just Westar. So, there's a lot of emotion that comes into it from many things.
Yeah, that pattern you're talking about, 67214, one of, if not the poorest zip code in Wichita. It was already impacted in the 70s when they bisected it to put in 135. Severely damaged community cohesion when that happened. One of the lowest levels of home ownership, highest levels of rental properties there. So yeah, it's a community that's already struggling, and now they've got more problems.
Well, but they've got $125 million to help overcome that. So hopefully that I get the pastor's in the spot on TV. I get his point there. Hopefully that money will be distributed in an equitable and fair way.
Yeah. And sometimes you make a mistake that you just can't undo. We've made mistakes in our newspapers. I can't unprint a newspaper. No. So I don't think it's realistic for them to start this process all over again. So when you can't redo something, what do you do? What can you do to make it right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, and certainly scholarships. Are you talking about a community that struggles financially? Scholarships are possibly a pretty good place to start.
Certainly.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have one more thing to talk about tonight. A few dollars could make a big difference in community security. Local cities and sheriff's departments are trying to lure more officers to solve a long-run problem with retention. KSN's Tiffany Lane has more.
It's a problem law enforcement has faced the last few years, a shortage of officers.
City Council earlier had passed a staffing study, the phase 1 of the staffing study. So we're trying to fill those positions.
Wednesday, Wichita Police announced a 33-cent increase to $22.46 an hour for recruits.
It's just like a sports team. You're trying to get that big next rising star, and it could come down to something as important as pay. Whether it be this team or that team, and we want to be as competitive as we can.
While police have their recruitment efforts in place, the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office has all hands on deck trying to fill positions at the detention facility.
Right ahead, facing wall.
Wednesday, 18 recruits were training in their final week before graduation, but even after they become detention deputies, the jail will still have about 50 openings.
Bring him down softly.
The Sheriff's Office has been reaching out through social media, career fairs, and also lowered the age for jail applicants from 19 to 18.
This allows us the opportunity to start them right into a law enforcement career.
One recent hire says when it all comes down to it, shortages are a safety concern.
Say a fight breaks out over here on this side of the jail, and another one breaks out here. What happens if we don't have enough deputies to go respond to those fights?
And those fights, certainly one of the reasons why it's hard to get deputies and police officers. Very dangerous jobs, and really they've gotten more dangerous over the last few years. You and I have covered plenty of those stories.
Yeah, it's it's a hard career. The lowering of the age obviously shows the difficulty that they're having in getting people in. I'm not sure that there is an easy solution to that. Obviously, money, like we're just talking about with the power poles, money goes so far, but that doesn't necessarily solve all of your problems.
No.
And as someone who has multiple law enforcement officials in their immediate family, they deserve more for what they do. And I'm glad to see Wichita Police Department up that raise. There's probably some other things that I'm sure that they're doing to try to increase recruitment and retention as well. But the same thing really could be said for Sedgwick County EMS and fire too. The pay is not great, and those are difficult and dangerous jobs. And so, yes, county and city leaders have a difficult job of deciding how to spend money. But you'd certainly think that you'd prioritize your public safety as much as possible.
Well, and certainly in the argument over taxes, one of the main tenets of why we have taxes is, of course, public roads and power, but also public safety, your fire departments, your police departments. At what point does it reach the point where we say, you know what, we need to raise taxes so we can pay these people better?
That's a great question, and that's why I'm not on the city council. And so, when we had the sales tax debate 4 years ago, 5 years ago,
I think it was.
Okay, I know that there was some talk about how Wichita hasn't raised the mill levy in a number of years, and we've tried to do some things. If it comes to that, I think that city leaders just need to engage the public as much as possible, engage leaders at the Wichita Police Department as much as possible, see where their needs are, what their needs are, and if need be, put it to a vote. Yeah. Do we raise taxes for our public safety workers?
No.
Yeah, and it's putting more money into a jail is a much harder sell. It's people feel really good about. Well, maybe not really good, but people will feel better about putting money into schools than they do into what they view as care for prisoners, even though you're talking about putting money in for the deputies themselves in an effort to get more of them and to ensure their safety.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait and see. It seems like I say that all the time here, but it really is the case. There's so much where things are changing, and it really does come down to the politicians, and that comes down to how people vote. Mm-hmm. So, and that's part of why we do the story, so people know what's going on, so they can vote well. Exactly. Do the story, do the show. And on that note, I'm going to call it quits. It's been a long week, and I can't always talk well. Rodney, Travis, thank you so much for being with us. I hope to see you both here again soon. I hope you've enjoyed what we had to discuss today. If you have any questions or you'd like to suggest another discussion topic, please feel free to email us at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, have a great week.